professional associations and labor unions, and they're all lobbying. And they all have congressmen and senators, and they lobby through their congressmen and senators, and they provide campaign funds for their congressmen and senators. And every aspect of the budget goes to a particular subcommittee of a particular committee of the House and the Senate. All revenue bills have to start in the House, but budget matters can be taken up first in either. Expenditures rather than revenue can be taken up in either house first. So then the subcommittee is lobbied heavily, and the subcommittee reports to the full committee, which is also then lobbied heavily by all of these organizations, so including the government departments, which also, through their representatives and senators who are influenced by those entities that are serviced by the Commerce Department or the Defense Department or the Interior Department or whatever. The departments and agencies of government also lobby the Congress. Or they simply do it directly. And they're not supposed to contradict the executive branch budget, but I mean, they often do. And say, really, there should be more here, less there, and whatever the case may be. Okay. So then, the budget is eventually, that aspect of the budget eventually is authorized by a committee, and all the other committees are going through the same, subcommittees and committees are going through the same process. Eventually, it's all put together in a single bill in the House and another bill in the Senate, and of course, they're different. So then you have to have a committee made up partly of senators and partly of representatives who try to come up with a single bill, which then goes back to both the House and the Senate. And at that point, everybody is lobbied all over again, and then hopefully the House and the Senate are going to pass the same bill. Well, that process takes so long and is so chaotic, and one might say anarchic, that very often, in fact more often than not at the present time for several years in the past, there is no budget by the time the budget is supposed to be passed. So then Congress passes what is called a continuing resolution, which simply continues the former budget as it was until the new budget is finally passed at some point. This is an unbelievably stupid way to engage in the budgetary process. And it results in a monstrosity, which is called the budget of the United States. And then that monstrosity has to be financed. So the Treasury Department and mostly the Treasury Department comes up with estimates of what they're going to raise in taxes versus what they have to borrow, and then they issue bills, notes, and bonds of the U.S. government to U.S. citizens and to citizens of other countries and to central banks of other countries and all over the place for this purpose, to cover the eventual necessities of the budget. Then there's going to be a third-class case study, which is an in-between case in this particular study is going to be the United Kingdom, Great Britain. Okay, how is economic policy in general made in the United States? Okay. There is in the Office of the President something called the Economic Council. The Economic Council is supposed to coordinate the economic policies of the various agencies and departments of the U.S. government. As the NSC, the National Security Council, of which I was a member in the Reagan administration, coordinates all of the policies and activities of the government that have to do with national security affairs. Obviously, much of national security affairs has to do with economics. I was chief economist of the NSC. And much of what the Economic Council does affects national security, so the two councils have a representative on, the NSC has a representative on the Economic Council, the Economic Council has a representative on the NSC, and other units in the White House also get involved in the policy-making process within the White House. And at the present time, this is particularly in the Obama administration, it's particularly centralized in the White House because he has appointed czars for just about everything. They're called czars. That is, there's a person who's in charge of this, and a person who's in charge of that, and a person who's in charge of something else. And the advantage of that to the president is that none of these people have to be approved by the Senate, as do the cabinet secretaries and other high officials of the U.S. government. So, the negotiation process goes on within the executive office of the president, and then it is vetted in the great departments of government, and will be the subject of the meetings of an interagency group that will be established for decisions of all kinds of various types, which will have representatives of the executive office of the president. It will also have representatives of the departments that are directly involved and any agencies that are also directly involved, such as the intelligence agencies or whatever. And they will meet and they will bargain and they will eventually come up with a recommendation to the president. Okay. So the president then will decide on a policy. It is the policy of this administration that we are going to do such and such on the economic side, either in terms of domestic policy or international economic policy. Good. Well, there are things the government, the executive branch, can do by itself. Doesn't require anything but the signature of the president. This particular administration, the Obama administration, has been expanding that activity a lot. And a lot of decisions are made by Mr. Obama himself with his own signature, and some members of Congress are getting pretty unhappy about it because these are decisions that have traditionally been made by the Congress, proposed by the president, but made by the Congress, and then sent back to the president or rejected, and sent back with changes or sent back as the president had presented them, either for his signature or his veto. Okay, if a particular policy obviously has to go to Congress, in other words, money has to be raised, for example, it has to go to the House first and then to the Senate, and it goes through this whole process of subcommittees and then committees and then the whole, and then the negotiation between the Senate and the House, and then going back to the House and back to the Senate with the subcommittees and the committees, and then eventually resulting in legislation, if legislation is required. And this becomes then the policy of the U.S. government with reference to some domestic economic matter or international economic matter. Okay, again, obviously, I have been engaged in simplification. Some might say oversimplification, but we have limited time, and you are welcome, not only welcome, but urged to send in your questions and comments between now and the next class. We will now begin the subject of international economics. And we will start with international trade. Keep in mind that international trade is simply trade with an adjective. All the rules of exchange and trade in general, domestic trade, also apply internationally, plus extra rules. International trade is trade among countries. France produces something which it exports to the United States, which either pays for it or exports something to France, and France pays for it, and et cetera, et cetera. And there is an international organization, the World Trade Organization, that regulates this activity, supposedly, that provides two things. One is a place for negotiation, and the other is a place for the settlement of disputes. If there is a trade dispute between country A and country B, country A will bring a case before the WTO, which will set up a dispute panel of experts who will make a decision that country A is right or country B is right. If they decide that country A is right, country B can appeal it, and then an appeals panel is set up, and the decision of the appeals panel is final. And all the member countries of the WTO have agreed to abide by decisions of the dispute panels. Or if they don't abide by them, they have to pay compensation. In other words, if, for example, an appeals panel of the WTO has decided that the United States has to fulfill its agreement with Mexico to allow Mexican trucks to bring goods into the United States, and the United States says we're still not going to do it, I'm obviously referring to an actual case, we're not going to allow it, the United States, Mexico is then able to establish tariffs on goods coming in from the United States that are to the same estimated value as the value to Mexico of being able to send its trucks into the United States, which is a difficult calculation, and whether they did it right or wrongly is a matter of controversy. At any rate, finally, the United States has seen the light and has done what it was supposed to do originally when it signed the original North American Free Trade Agreement. So, countries export, countries import. They export goods, they also export services. If a law firm in the United States is hired by a corporation in France, the law firm in the United States is exporting services to France. The French corporation is importing services from the United States, and therefore it goes into the national accounts of the United States and France. So, there is a very large trade in services as well as a very large trade in goods among countries. And these are called the national accounts. The national accounts include both trade and monetary and financial transfers. Both trade and financial transfers. We'll go into international finance in a moment. The balance of merchandise trade between country A and country B is based on the value of the goods only, produced and exported by country A to country B, and the value of goods exported by country B to country A. So the country B may have a surplus in its merchandise trade balance with country B, or it may have a deficit. Okay. When you add services, as well as short-term financial transactions up to 1 year, you have what is called a balance on current account. And since a country may have a merchandise trade deficit with another country, but a services surplus with the other country, the balance on current account may be the opposite of what it is in the case of the merchandise trade balance. Country B may have a surplus in the balance on current account, and country B may have a deficit. Okay. Now, when it comes to longer-term financial transactions, which are divided into two categories, and now we're getting into international finance. Two categories are capital transfers and investments, foreign direct investments, FDI. So you have, in the one case, loans and grants, mostly loans, and in the other case, you have investment. And this is the balance on capital account. And a country may have, country A may have a surplus on current account with country B, and a deficit on capital account with country B. And in terms of its overall balance with the rest of the world is called the balance of payments, and this balance of payments is always in balance. Because the deficit or surplus on the current account will be exactly compensated by the deficit or surplus on capital account. And that's why I mentioned a long time ago that you have to be careful with what you read and hear, because a lot of economic journalism is written by people who really don't know very much about economics. And you will undoubtedly read that the balance of payments of country A or country B is in deficit, or the balance of payments is in surplus, and it's nonsense, because the balance of payments is always in balance. Okay, what difference does it make? Okay. If a country such as the United States, let's take the United States as an example. The United States has a very large merchandise trade deficit. It has a considerably smaller services surplus. So its balance on current account is heavily in deficit. So it has to be made up by the capital account. And since the amount of foreign direct investment that goes into the United States does not make up for the full deficit on current account, the rest has to be borrowed from the rest of the world. And that's why China, for example, which has a very large surplus, merchandise trade surplus with the United States, is building up huge dollar balances. The same thing is true of Japan. The same thing is true of the oil exporting countries such as the Gulf countries I mentioned before, Saudi Arabia. And the United States is building up a larger and larger international debt with the rest of the world. And the rest of the world, with many differences, of course, but the rest of the world as a whole is becoming a larger and larger creditor of the United States. Does this matter? Yes, of course it matters. It matters because when the United States is in a situation as it is in the present time, when economic growth is very weak, it is not generating the kind of wealth that would enable it to easily service this debt that it's accumulating. And it therefore has to, since the budget deficit continues to grow, it has to borrow more and more abroad, both to cover its internal deficit, budget deficit, as well as to cover its external trade and finance deficit. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a situation where countries trade and countries finance, countries invest, and this is international economics. Just as there is the World Trade Organization, there is the International Monetary Fund, which is supposed to do for financial transfers what the WTO does for trade. Basically, what it does is finance current account deficits of countries when they have such deficits. more recently has been getting involved in participating in rescue efforts for countries that have serious solvency as well as liquidity problems. And that's probably a very bad idea, but it is a pot of money that is being used for this purpose. And then you have the development banks, the international development banks, which we'll go into next week when we discuss that aspect of international finance. We'll just start it very quickly and finish it next week. Development, which we will discuss much more fully next week, in the world is financed in various ways. It's financed, of course, internally, domestically, if you like, and it's financed through direct investment from other countries. It's also financed through international financial institutions, such as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is a post-World War II institution, usually referred to as the World Bank. Now, every one of the major regions of the world has an international or regional development bank also. There is the Inter-American Development Bank. There is the African Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is a post-collapse of the Soviet Union development, mostly for the benefit of the Eastern European countries, which came out of the Soviet orbit when the Soviet Union collapsed. All of these institutions make loans and investments in the countries where they do business. In the case of the World Bank, it's the world. In the case of the IMF, it's the world, which does not make, it makes loans, but it does not make investments. In the case of the regional banks, it's the countries where it operates, where they operate. The African Development Bank is located in the Ivory Coast. The Asian Development Bank is located in the Philippines. The Inter-American Development Bank is located in Washington. And the European Bank for Research and for Reconstruction and Development is located in London. There are also institutions of a regional nature that have to do with trade agreements. For example, the European Union, and we'll talk about the different kinds of trade agreements in the future. The European Union has what is called the European Investment Bank, which is located in Luxembourg. And the European Investment Bank, as the name implies, makes loans and investments in the member countries of the European Union. There is a similar institution between the United States and Mexico. And there are others in various areas of the world which have trade agreements. Some of them are primarily involved with trade finance. Others are involved with more with investment and longer-term loans. In any case, international finance is divided into various categories. And again, I'm just going to mention them now, and then we'll take them up in greater detail next week. But the various categories are trade finance, development loans, and direct investment. They each have their place, they each have their role, they each have their particular institutions. They are very different in what they do and how they do it. So I'm just going to mention now trade finance, which is the simplest, and we'll go into the others next week.